Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV. We here are lifelong Catholics, and what we do here is all for free. In love of Jesus Christ, the most holy Trinity, and His holy Church, and will defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Our work is the true sense of apostolate. Any funds raised goes back into this work for equipment. This helps us to give you an unbiased and hard-hitting truth that is not controlled by political correctness or interest groups. And today is our show on Robert E. Lee and is going through seeing if the war's breaking out and he needs to decide, do we join with the Confederate States or what do we do? So it might be a little longer program because his entire law thinking is pretty much laid out in great detail, so I'm trying to see if we can cover it all. So we welcome Brother Alexis Bonello to the show.
Thank you, AJ, for having me back. Talk about this great American figure of American military history and American political history. And as much as he might be vilified, we need to know about the life and deeds of Lee, because without it, you really don't understand what was going on in the United States in the 19th century. And I think the significance of it is mostly shown by the fact that he actually led the U.S. Marine forces against the Harper's Ferry incident right before the outbreak of the war, and the year before. And yet he was the one that surrenders the Confederate forces at 5 years later to General Grant of the U.S. Army. So he probably would have never imagined the course of events that would take place. And this has been depicted in many films, but the role of Lee hasn't really been focused on. And so that's this is what makes this program so interesting and so useful for everyone in the United States to listen to.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so we're at Harper's Ferry. Is that where we left off, right?
He's back home in Arlington, and he's 54 years old, and he's thinking back from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and now what's going on with the Virginia Convention, thinking, are what we're going to be doing in line with the Constitution? And so he lays out his complete thoughts from his father and great-grandfather, who was one of the leaders of the conventions and helped get the Constitution all passed and everything for the country. Now he's like, I have a huge decision to come up with. And so we began to read what his nephew writes about this massive decision he has to do. Robert E. Lee was now 54 years old, and the wheel of time had recorded 32 years of honorable service in the Army of the United States. During that time, his country had grown in population and increased in wealth and territory, far exceeding the expectations and hopes of her people. This profession had absorbed his attention to such an extent that he had scarcely noticed a gathering war cloud destined to discharge death and destruction upon the American Republic, as well as mark a most important epoch in his own life and career. The Constitution adopted by the Convention of Philadelphia in 1787 was the result of a compromise of opinions of its members. The scope and extent of the powers to be conferred on a government to be created by the representatives of the states. The line marking those powers and the rights reserved by the states was the most difficult problem to solve. On the one hand, if too little power were conferred on the legislative, executive, and judicial departments of the federal government, Its organization might at any moment be broken to pieces, was not strong enough to enforce its legal decrees. On the other hand, should too much power be delegated, a strong central government might result in the creators, the states, might be crushed out of existence by an instrument of their own creation. The people would in that case be returned to a former government they abhorred, and from whose tyrannical methods their forefathers had breathed the waves of the Atlantic, and incurred all dangers in settling a newly discovered country. The safety of the states was the safety of the people, and only limited and defined powers must be conferred upon the government of the United States. The Constitution, the supreme law of the land, must state in writing exactly the rights delegated by the states for their common government. The powers not so delegated were reserved by the states to themselves. They possessed them because they had never parted with them. An attempt in the Philadelphia Convention to insert a clause in the Constitution prohibiting a state's withdrawal from the Union, then being formed, could not have succeeded, while an express provision authorizing such succession would have been regarded as unwise and suggestive of disunion of states, which were then trying to form a more perfect union. If the framers of the Constitution, when at work in the Quaker City, said nothing upon this very important point, the states to be bound, if they ratified it, said much. They did not purpose to be blindly gagged and bound to the wheels of the federal chariot, for they possessed sovereign power. In the Declaration of Independence, the colonies were not declared independent of Great Britain in a collective capacity, but each separate colony was transformed thereby into an independent state, and so His Britannic Majesty treats them by name in a provisional agreement in 1782, when George III withdrew the scepter of his power from the Virginia colony. It was an empire in territory and became absolutely a free, independent, and sovereign state. The allegiance of our citizens to her was undisputed and admitted. Before the life blood could circulate in the veins of the new government, it must be stamped with the approbation of the states. It had no power to act unless ratified by 9 of these states. If the other 4 did not ratify the Constitution, the government so formed was not binding on them. The state conventions called for this purpose were for most part cautious and exceedingly slow of action.
Yeah, it's a very good argument about secession. He's trying to establish that the silence of the Constitution can't be argued on it, on the basis of it, and probably because the argument's coming from the Union, where the clause is not in there that you have the right, and so here's a man who really wanted to preserve America for what it was, and not alter its sense, and yet respond to a strife that had not been foreseen.
Mm-hmm.
So how does he continue to elaborate his thought on this?
To the state of Lee's nativity, the independence of the colonies, their union afterward as states was largely due. One of her sons held the sword and another the pen that accomplished this great work. The superb oratory of another kept the campfires of the Revolution burning brightly, while in ringing tones still another of her citizens moved. That these united colonies are and of the right ought to be free, independent states, that all political connection between these states and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. 9 states, acquisite number, had approved the Constitution before Virginia acted. The debates in her convention on this subject have no equal intellectual vigor. Mental giants, full armed with wisdom, fought on either side, and one rank opposed to the adoption of the Constitution, as it came from the hands of its framers, was Patrick Henry, George Mason, Richard Henry Lee, James Monroe, Benjamin Harrison, William Grayson, and the other were James Madison, John Marshall, Edmund Randolph, Edmund Pendleton, and General Henry Lee. And behind them, as a powerful reserve, was the great influence of Washington. On the final vote, friends of the measure secured a majority of only 10 votes. The next state to adopt it after Virginia was New York, and she did so only by 3 votes. North Carolina did not join the Union immediately. In Rhode Island for 15 months after the new Constitution had gone into operation. Delay in the action of these states and the close votes in so many others was the result of the undefined fear in the public mind that as years rolled on, the government they were then creating might in turn destroy the autonomy of the various states. Boy, he was a prophet.
Yeah, the worries of the of many writers of that age were turned out to be true. Didn't take it. It was just a slight imbalance there. I think it's the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment was left there as an amendment, and it was never referred to. It became a dead letter as soon as it was written. But it really should have been put as one of the first principles of the Constitution, right up front, and then it would have been kept in people's in front of everyone's eyes.
I was like, what do we got now? Almost all 50 states with this COVID nonsense. Tyranny.
Coming down from Washington.
Yeah. Massachusetts, South Carolina, New York had made as the price of their ratifying the Constitution amendments so guard as far as possible against consolidated powers. Robert Lee knew all this. He knew also that his own state had been remarkably careful upon this important point, for she had declared, upon consenting to go into the Union then formed by the action of 9 states, that the powers granted under the Constitution, being truly derived from the people of the United States, may be resumed by them whenever the same shall be perverted to their injury or oppression. Boy, it's happening now.
Yeah, this is the argument for the South secession. It's the 10th Amendment. So,
As I love the quote, the South shall rise again. Maybe. Without any act without any act of his, face to face he was confronted with the great question: loyalty to the general government or loyalty to Virginia? Would it be treason to substitute for the E pluribus unum written upon the scroll of the beak of the eagles Virginius, sic semper tyrannis? He had been taught when a boy that his first duty was to his mother, Commonwealth. How then could he be a traitor if he placed his hand in hers and knelt at her feet when she called him lovingly to her side? His elevated character and
conscientiousness.
oh yeah, a purpose appealed to him to decide in an honorable way this question. During this anxious moments, how his thoughts must have marched and countermarched upon the constitutional questions. At that very time, he might have heard a distinguished senator, who afterward became vice president and president of the United States, declare from his seat that the federal government possessed no sovereign power, that it could not coerce a state, that under the Constitution you could not apprehend any of the states as a party, and that all powers of the general government were derived, and that it had no single primitive power. The study of the early history of his country convinced Lee that while the succession of a state from the Union might not be a remedy, it was not a violation of the Constitution so far as the original 13 states were concerned. He probably found also in the anxious study he then making to arrive at a proper solution of the question that this theory of constitutional government was recognized by most of the states when the Union was formed.
Mhm. So here we have that Catholic principle going back to the original meaning of the document, which neither the Masons nor the Liberals tolerate.
Mhm. For instance, Massachusetts had declared in 1809, when the Embargo Act was passed by Congress, that it was not binding upon her citizens. And in December 1810, one of her members of Congress declared that if Louisiana were admitted into the Union, it would lead to its dissolution. The New England states would succeed, amicably if they might, forcibly if they must. And he found similar instances in the history of the Pennsylvania and Kentucky. In Pennsylvania, he found that the state had placed herself on record by an act of her legislator, as well as by her governor, to prevent a decree of the United States judge from being executed, boldly asserting that it was her duty to protect her citizens, and to her their allegiance must first be given. In this examination of this perplexing subject, he might have noticed that the Constitution of the United States at that time made it mandatory on the governor of a state to give up a fugitive from justice to the governor of the state he had fled from, in order that he might be tried by the laws of that state. But that notwithstanding the Constitution, governors of sovereign states did not give up offenders unless they chose to do so. Indeed, in a rendition contest between the states of Ohio and Kentucky, Mr. Taney, then Chief Justice of the United States, delivering a decision of the court, said, while admitting that the Constitution was mandatory on the governors, there was not a line in it which gave power to the general government to compel a state to do anything. That's the solution to stop this COVID stuff.
Exactly, yeah. Hmm. If they wanted to.
Yeah. We had probably read too that a convention composed of representatives of New England states had assembled in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814 to protest against the war with England because of the great damage it was inflicting on the shipping interests of that section. You might have seen that succession was advocated as a remedy, while the declaration was made that if the Union be destined to dissolution, some new form of confederacy should be substituted among those states, which shall not need to maintain a federal relation with each other. Fortunately, the peace was declared with Great Britain, or at that time there might have been a succession of the New England states. It was an interesting question to this lieutenant colonel of cavalry, that if this action had been taken by the New England states, and the states remaining in the Union had invaded their territory for the purpose of coercion, upon what side would the large majority of the citizens of New England states have been found fighting? The more Robert E. Lee thought upon the subject, the more he became convinced. First, that Virginia, in seceding from the Union, was exercising the right she had reserved when she entered it. Second, that if war must follow, his sword should be drawn in her defense, not be pointed against her. In the soil of old Virginia were buried those nearest and dearest to him. His ancestors had first settled within her limits. She was to be invaded because she exercised the right not denied her by the Constitution, and her course had been determined by the convention of the representatives of her people duly called to consider the question, and a convention voiced the highest authority of a state. He may have deplored her action, but he could not oppose his judgment to the collective wisdom of her representatives, whose action had been solemnly endorsed by her people at the polls. The, the irrepressible conflict had to be met in his own person. He had seen could not prevent the sections from drifting apart. If interests of the manufacturing and shipping states of the North and the agricultural states of the South were not in entire harmony, he had hoped that the possible remedy might be found. Mr. Lincoln received only 1,857,000 of the popular vote, while Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell received 2,800,000 votes. But that was not sufficient reason, in his opinion, to declare war. If he had much to do with John Brown's body lying moldering in the ground, the fact that his spirit was marching on down the abolition ranks did not disturb him. His state, when a colony was opposed to slavery, the first speech his eloquent relative Richard Henry Lee ever ever made was in favor of the motion to lay so heavy a duty on the importation of slave as in fact to put an end to the iniquitous and disgraceful traffic in the colony of Virginia. Lee had read too Jefferson's indictment of Great Britain for allowing the slave trade when he penned the Declaration of Independence. He knew that slavery existed in the northern states so long as it was profitable and was abolished. When it was not, and that the Mayflower, which landed the Pilgrim Fathers on Plymouth Rock, sailed on its very next voyage with a cargo of slaves. He had found negroes shucking corn and hoeing potatoes. They had always been kindly treated by him, and no more happy, contented, and well-clothed and well-fed negroes ever existed than those at Arlington. He would not have fought to preserve slavery. He disapproved of it, and had years before freed his own. And Mr. Custis had freed by will of his. He regretted war, but did not regret as one of its results the probable freedom of slaves. Although he knew that slavery had been called a race of savages from superstition and idolatry, and imparted to them a general knowledge of precepts of religion. Indeed, he is recorded as saying at the time that if he owned all Negroes of the South, he would gladly yield them up for the preservation of the Union. In 1861, Lee hoped and prayed that the temple of American liberty might still stand in the majesty of its vast proportions, and complete in all of its parts, each pillar representing with equal strength an American state.
They were very careful about all these decisions back then, and they really wanted to uphold what was right and what was wrong. If you'd have to say anything, it was they were using a lot of good reasons to defend recognizing civil rights of blacks, because the whole question of the freeing of the slaves doesn't mean that a plantation becomes unprofitable. You could still pay them a salary, and in fact, after many slaves were freed, they remained on the plantations, became sharecroppers. So,
Yeah.
and Lee was writing this because I think, as we mentioned on a previous show, he was called to the Virginia legislature to respond to or participate in the debate on secession. Wasn't that true?
Yeah.
And these quotes that you're reading of his writings, does this come from a book or from letters?
It comes from his nephew's book.
Mm-hmm. Generally a biography.
Mm-hmm.
Is that currently in print?
Yeah. They sold out of this edition, so I've been trying to post whatever edition's available.
Okay. Would they sell out after we mentioned it on our program?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we did the publisher a favor.
So, so he sincerely hoped each state would pursue the path designated for it by the Constitution. As the planets revolve in well-defined orbits around the great central sun, he wrote from Texas in 1861 that he could not anticipate a greater calamity for the country than the dissolution of the Union, that he was willing to sacrifice anything but honor for its preservation. And in another letter from Fort Mason, Texas, January 1861, to Mrs. Lee, he says, "You see by a former letter that I received from Major Everett's life of Washington, you sent me, enjoyed it, perusal very much. How his spirit would be grieved could he see the wreck of his mighty labors. I will not, however, permit myself to believe till all ground for hope is gone, that the work of his noble deeds will be destroyed, that his precious advice and virtuous example will soon be forgotten by his countrymen. As far as I can judge from my papers, we are between a state of anarchy and civil war. May God avert us from both. I fear mankind for years will not be sufficiently Christianized to bear the absence of restraint and force. I see that 4 states have declared themselves out of the Union. 4 more apparently will follow their example. Then if the border states are dragged into the gulf of revolution, one half of the country will be arrayed against the other. And I must try and be patient and wait the end, for I can do nothing to hasten or retard it."
So he must have written these words in the like December or January of 1860, 61.
Mhm.
As to remind everyone that the Civil War broke out after the election in November of 1860, when Lincoln wins the presidency, and the states who supported the other candidate, I forget even who his name was, decided
Douglas.
to, Douglas, decided to secede rather than accept Lincoln as their president. Mhm.
It was hard for Lee to give up his position in the army and separate himself from his army comrades and associates. He wrote in 1849 from Mobile, Alabama, "I have met many officers of the garrison who were with me in Mexico. You have often heard me say that quarterly and friendship in the army was the great attraction of the service. It is that, I believe, that has kept me in it so long, and it is that which now makes me fear to leave it. I did not know where I should meet with so much friendship out of it." While he was wrestling with this disturbing question at Arlington, his old commander Scott, just across the river, was pleading for him to remain in the service of the United States. The veteran general had impressed the president with the distinguished services of Colonel Lee, and urged that every effort should be made to keep him on the side of the Union, going so far as to say that he would be worth 50,000 men to their cause.
That's kind of prophetic, because he himself was worth that much in Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Oh, man.
Yeah, excuse me a moment. I will get a glass of water for myself.
Yeah. I'll take a little intermission here, folks. So absorb all that information so far. We do not have true constitutional lawyers, nothing like the mind of General Lee here. If we
That's
did,
because, yeah, we don't, because after the Civil War, they reinterpreted the entire Constitution in a Federalist way to basically wipe out all state sovereignty. After the Civil War, there is no more state sovereignty. There is only a federal government.
mm-hmm. I mean, if we had, yeah.
They feared they had to wipe out state sovereignty, which in the Civil War proved. The Civil War is often told it's all about slaves, but it's about states' rights. And though we don't agree with the South in its determination to keep slaves anymore, there's a still strong faction for states' rights. And so unless they wiped out the sovereignty of the states, the same thing would happen again. And I think by now the North is controlled by wealthy families who look at the United States as their plantation. They want to run it their way, and they're not going to let it run any other way.
Mm-hmm.
They want all the profit for themselves, and this is reflected when the Civil War does break out, and Lincoln calls up the recruits of the North, but he exempts the sons of the wealthy. And this is a sign that America is no longer America. When the North declares the war in the South and exempts the sons of the wealthy, you have something going wrong there, radically wrong, because that's completely unconstitutional.
Yeah. And which is why it's going to be a fight, folks. It will be a fight, but a good one for the Catholic Party of America. That's pretty much what we're going to be doing, is what Lee is talking about. Restoring the sovereignty of the states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, unless it's restored, then you're always going to have this imbalance. It's the only way to counter the corruption in Washington, you know.
And get true, actual constitutional lawyers who have the same thinking of not Fitzhugh and Robert Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the government can't tell you to do anything. You're a sovereign state. You can even say, I don't think so.
Yeah. Have to be constitutional lawyers that just don't follow the totally Masonic rewrite that's been going on in the Supreme Court and federal law since. So you have to first abandon the whole concept for precedent law. Precedent interpretation is just, if we commit an injustice and make that a tradition, then it becomes law. That's completely false. It's not a Catholic principle. And that's why good Catholic jurists never get to the Supreme Court, only corrupt ones. Because good Catholic jurists, like who was it? It was about 10, 15 years ago, he was nominated to the Supreme Court, but they botched him. What was his name? Bork. Because Bork read the Constitution the way Lee read the Constitution, and they couldn't suffer that. And I think this is why they appoint so many fake Catholics to the Supreme Court, because they're trying to convince Catholics, who are the biggest threats, not to start applying their faith to the Constitution and interpreting it in an objective sense, because then all the lies will unravel, all the injustices will be exposed, and you'll see that, well, at least since the Civil War, there has been no constitutional order in the United States. It's a private club running the country to their own advantage.
Yeah. As we've seen by Sutton.
Yeah, that level of corruption that Sutton's talking about, which is 1913 now and onward, it could never have come to pass before the Civil War, when the banks were all independent under state charters.
Yeah. That reminds me of a platform.
Okay, so to continue with Lee, is he still discussing the legal basis for the independence?
Yeah. Pretty much his entire chapter. So if you think it's getting too much for him, let me know.
Let's hear some more of his reasonings. This is something all Americans need to hear, I think.
Probably was due to Scott that Mr. Lincoln requested Mr. Francis Preston Blair to have an interview with Lee and secure him by tempting offer of the command of the active army of the United States. Neither the president nor his officers knew the man. 3 years after the war, in a letter to the Honorable Reverend Johnson of Maryland, dated February 25th, 1868, is found for the first time his account of this interview. After listening to Blair's remarks, writes Lee, I declined the offer he made me to take command of the army that was to be brought into the field, stating as candidly and courteously as I could that though opposed to success in the deprecating war, I could take no part in the invasion of the Southern states.
Yeah, he would never have taken up arms against his own people.
Mm-hmm. I went directly from the interview with Mr. Blair to the office of General Scott, told him of the proposition had been made me, and my decision. After reflection upon returning home, I concluded that I ought no longer to retain any commission I held in the United States Army. Yet on the second morning thereafter, I forwarded my resignation to General Scott. At the time, I hoped that peace would have been preserved, that some way would be found to save the country from the calamities of war. And I then had no other intention than to pass the remainder of my life as a private citizen. 2 days afterwards, on the invitation of the governor of Virginia, I repaired to Richmond, and found that the convention then in succession had passed an ordinance withdrawing the states from the Union and accepted the commission of commander of its forces, which was tendered me. Okay. Oh, this is beautiful, this little part right here. Since the Son of Man stood on the mount, said an orator, and saw all the kingdoms of the earth and the glory thereof stretching before him, and turned away from them to the agony and bloody sweat of Gethsemane, and the cross to Calvary beyond. No follower of the meek and lowly Savior can have undergone a more trying ordeal, or met it with more heroic spirit of sacrifice. I love that quote.
They were very deeply in their Christian faith. It would have been one thing if the North hadn't attacked the South, you know, and the North really engineered the whole pretext. We're told in public schools, well, South Carolina attacked the Union fort, and therefore they're the ones that started the war. But South Carolina only did that because the Union troops would not surrender Fort Carolina, and the federal government was claiming an absolute novelty, namely that the military installations of the United States were not part of state territory. Okay. That was their basis for starting the Civil War. They wouldn't give up the fort there, Fort Sumter. The funny thing is nowadays they hold the exact opposite principle. It was about some 20 years ago, some workers at the Philadelphia shipyard on the state of Pennsylvania, who went to work every day from New Jersey by crossing the Delaware River in a boat and never actually entering the state of Pennsylvania, held that they shouldn't pay Pennsylvania income tax on their salary for working at the naval yard because they were not in Pennsylvania. They were on a federal military installation. And it went to the Supreme Court, which ruled no, you are in the state of Philadelphia, even if you're on a military installation, because the military installation is in the state of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Well, then, so why is it that someone working on a military base must pay Pennsylvania income tax, but Fort Sumter doesn't belong to South Carolina?
Yeah.
See, there we have the Masonic two-faced lies. You know, the lie serves its purposes, whatever they say at the time.
Yeah.
Which means that
yeah.
I'll just finish the thought, which means that Fort Sumter should have surrendered, and in not surrendering, they committed an act of war against South Carolina.
And I don't know if they were doing it back then, but I learned one time because it came in the news for some odd reason that Camp Pendleton in California, the Marine base there, didn't pay its rent to California for the land.
Or they just took the land, they never paid rent for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's, every way they want it, right?
So I don't know if they back then paid rent for state land back then or what, but that could have been an interesting case to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, well, maybe in Camp Pendleton, they began by leasing the land and never bought it. Whereas
Yeah.
in other places, but the thing is that even if you buy land in a state, it's still under the jurisdiction of the state. The sale of land doesn't transfer jurisdiction, because this is one thing that people don't understand is, why do we call the country United States of America? Because every state is sovereign. But there's another point. Since every state is sovereign, the federal government is not sovereign. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because if the federal government's sovereign, where's its territory? It has no territory. It's not sovereign. The states are sovereign. Okay? Which means the federal government can never claim land belongs to it, except insofar as Chrysler could claim that land belongs to its company. Okay? Which means the land is still under state jurisdiction. And that's the original intent of the Constitution, that state law trumps any federal claims within its state boundaries. So if
Mm-hmm.
you have a federal park in the state of Kansas, the Kansas government has authority over that, not the federal government.
Huh. Yeah, just got a new one. Uh, so before 2.5 months before Colonel Lee's resignation, the Convention of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had respectively passed ordinances in taking these states out of the Union, and the delegates had assembled at Montgomery, Alabama, and formed a new government under the name of the Confederate States of America. On February 4th, the date of the birth of the new government, at Virginia's request, a peace conference composed of delegates from 21 states met in Washington. The Congress of the United States rejected all terms of settlement proposed by it, and rising a tide of sectional strife passed the high water mark. So all the states met in Washington for peace.
Interesting.
And Washington rejected them.
The thing is, now we had, I don't see how Washington could reject it, because war could only be declared by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Well, if all the southern states succeeded, they certainly didn't have 2/3 vote in the Senate. So how did the North even declare war?
That Fort Sumner issue.
Yeah, but nevertheless, they can't declare war without consent of Congress, because the president can't declare war. So how was that declaration of war even constitutional? Certainly the representatives of the South didn't vote for war against the South. So that means it was unconstitutional, the war of the North against the South. Whereas we've already explained it was absolutely constitutional for South Carolina to demand Fort Sumner surrender.
Yeah.
Which means that the war of the North was an unjust war.
That keeps adding to their tally. If the 7 southern states which first formed the Confederacy were terribly in earnest so equally with the northern and eastern states in opposition to the new government, the border states upon whose breasts the storm of war must break, were still hoping for a peaceful solution of the trouble, the problem was soon solved for them. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, out of the waters rises the fortress of the United States called Sumter. It is situated in the middle of the harbor and was erected on an artificial island built on shoals. Its walls were 8 feet thick, 40 feet high. It was five-sided, enclosing a space of about 350 feet. On its ramparts and its casements, 140 guns could be mounted, and its full garrison was 600 men. This fort was originally occupied only by an engineer. One engineer. He was now employing some workmen in its repairs. But at Fort Moultrie, on a narrow neck of land extending into the harbor, was a garrison of 69 soldiers and 9 officers under the command of Major Robert Anderson. This officer, having every reason to apprehend an attack upon his position, decided to abandon Moultrie and take possession of Sumter, which he did on the night of the December 26th. Robert Anderson was a Kentuckian and a West Point graduate of the class of 1827, whose sympathies at the beginning of the war were rather on the side of the South. He continued to occupy with his little force this island fort, while Beauregard, who had resigned from the United States Army, was already commissioned by the succeeding states, was building hostile batteries on every side. A crisis this harbor was first approaching. The government of the United States decided to make an attempt to throw men and provisions into the fort. And when this became known, orders were issued from Montgomery for Beauregard to open his batteries. In the gray of the morning at 4:30 on a certain Friday, April 12, 1861, a single shot fired from the Confederate batteries at Fort Johnson announced that the bombardment of a fort over whose grim walls floated the stars and stripes was about to begin. The report of the bursting of the shell started the country from center to circumference. The angel of peace, which for months had been hovering over the Republic, plumbed his wings for flight, and the demon of war reigned supreme. President Lincoln followed this act of war by issuing a proclamation calling for 75,000 troops. A prompt response was given to him by the governors of the northern states, but those of Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, Virginia, and Missouri declined in terms more or less emphatic.
It's interesting. We were taught in public school that Sumter was defended by U.S. garrison of the northern troops, but we're never told that it was actually the North who took Sumter after South Carolina declared independence. So there's no way that Anderson had any right to go to Sumter. That's South Carolina territory. So it was an invasion, and the North did begin the war. It wasn't the South.
The succession of all these states from the United States followed, except Kentucky and Missouri, whose sympathies were divided. Their union with a government formed at Montgomery, Alabama, was speedily made. On April 17, 1861, the ordinance of succession was passed by the Virginia Convention. The day following, Lee had a long interview with his old commander, General Scott. On the 20th, the die was cast. His Rubicon was crossed, for the resignation of his commission in the Army of the United States was respectfully tendered to the War Department. His letter explanatory of his position at that time, though familiar to the public, is given here as the best expression of his feelings upon so momentous a subject. Arlington, Virginia, April 20th, 1861. General, since my interview with you on the 18th, I have felt that I no longer to retain my commission in the Army. I therefore tender my resignation, which I request you will recommend for acceptance. It would have been presented at once, but for the struggle it has cost me to separate myself from a service to which I have devoted the best years of my life and all the ability I possessed. During the whole of that time, more than a quarter of a century, I have experienced nothing but kindness from my superiors and a most cordial friendship of my comrades. To no one, General, have I been as much indebted as to yourself for uniform kindness and consideration, and it has always been my ardent desire to merit your approbation. I shall carry to the grave the most grateful recollections of your kind consideration, and your name and the fame shall always be dear to me. Save in the defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword. Be pleased to accept my most earnest wishes for the continuance of your happiness and prosperity, and believe me most truly yours. Signed, Robert E. Lee.
I don't think any letter was ever written so graciously by someone from armed forces of one state seceding from its own nation. And I think that's a good point we could end today's program on, to show that character of Lee was really, he had a really high character. He had a real deep Christian character. He was a true patriot. He was trying to do the best he could do. And that the issues were a lot more than just slavery here.
Mm-hmm.
And that the North was just totally in the wrong on how to solve it. Here we go back to, let's remind everyone, because we're Catholics, Catholic principles of just war. A war, to be just, has to be, first of all, legal and constitutional. You can't declare war without proper basis. And you can't say, I'm going to declare war on you for some injustice that's been habitually condoned already for decades. Okay, it would be one thing if the South decided one day, we're going to make slavery legal, and that was unconstitutional, and they wouldn't follow the directives of the Supreme Court. Well, then you could say you had some duty to restore the order of justice. But the United States was founded in slavery, and it was one of the conditions of the Constitutional Convention. Now, the states in the North agreed the states in the South could keep doing what they're doing. So the North had no basis to demand the South give that up. That was attacking the fundamental agreement which would form the Union. And if they did it, they at least have to do it by an act of law of Congress or amendment of the Constitution. They cannot do it by war. That's an act of terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have, in its very seed form, everything that the United States has become today that's bad, that's not the United States. It's the tyranny of Washington, D.C. is controlled by New York banks.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So please, I urge you, get this book. It won't be this exact uh, book because, as I said, when we first started doing the shows, they sold out quickly. So it'll be a similar type book of the same title and everything, but hopefully it'll have the same letters and everything. This was a special edition I found, and it had all the letters and everything. So please get this book. It's linked in the show page whenever we do a show from this book. So please get it. You need to read it. It's history that is not taught, but will be taught if you join the Catholic Party of America.
Yeah, because this is the true history of America, and it shows you what realize. Unless we recognize what the true history of the United States, we'll never be able to make make America great. I won't add the word again, but it has to be made better,
Mm-hmm.
as only Christians could do. Recognize objective norms and not who the winner gets to redefine everything.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you can. So the book's linked in the show page. Just click on the cover title of the book. It'll take you to Amazon where the book is, and it's think it's about the same as Sutton books, about 14, 15 bucks. Which ain't bad.
No, that's a very good price for such a good book.
So this is Ultimate Terrorist Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Vult.